Oh, hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Sorry for the long delay, much longer than I expected. There was a death of my best friend, my brother, so to speak, right around December, and yeah, losing someone that close to you definitely beats the creativity at you pretty quick. So this will be part 2 of the Pseudoscience of Hate. If you want to go back to part 1, I'll have a link in the description down below. The first one talks about why race realism is pseudoscience and the data to back that up. The second part is going to be on why this appeals to individuals, what demographics it appeals to, and why it appeals to those demographics, demonstrates itself today versus how it demonstrated itself 50 years ago or 70 years ago, and kind of look at what are the contributing factors that make this such a pertinent and pressing issue in 2020. So with this video, I'm going to touch on 2 broad aspects of widespread appeal. First off, the individuals that it draws upon, the individuals that feel some sort of connection or meaning inside of these groups. What are they gaining by being a part of this kind of a movement? Now, obviously, that can be as granular as the individual or as broad as you want it to be. I don't want to spend hours on that specific subject, but I want to touch on a few main factors, including a few that I think that people aren't as aware of as they need to be. And second, I want to look at how the movement itself has evolved over the past, especially the past decade or 2 decades, from where it's traditionally been to what it is today and what they're trying to do to get their message across or to give it more widespread appeal. This will both incorporate a lot of the issues with the race realist white national movement as a whole, as well as some of the agitating or enticing people into this particular movement. That's not to say that opposition to this stuff is bad. I'm taking an amoral position on that because the fact is that when you're dealing with an issue like this, people are going to respond the way that they're going to respond. So I'm not trying to eliminate certain types of reactions to it. I just want to talk about what are some factors that really help groups like the Proud Boys or people like Jared Taylor to ground their message in the 21st century in spite of basing it on such an anachronistic interpretation of genetics and speciation and the human race as a whole. So yeah, this thing is going to touch on everyone from Viktor Frankl to Count Dankula, from the Splc to the Proud Boys. So it's going to be a little bit all over, but I hope that through this you can kind of get a clearer sense of the emergence or re-emergence of this activism, where that's deriving from, and then the final video will be about solutions that we could have to the issue. What can be done about these types of ideological practices that, while not prohibiting them, make them relegated to the gutters where they deserve to be. So first things first. Ever more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. It's from Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. He was an individual that survived the Holocaust and wrote about his experiences, both in terms of personal narrative and in terms of the psychology behind his ability to survive through such hardships. When people seek to find meaning through their identity, that in of itself is certainly not a negative or something that you should frown upon yourself for doing. But it's also an avenue through which this conflation between ethnicity and heritage and skin color can shine through to a certain extent, that Western cultures or European cultures are just fundamentally better than the rest of the world. All the great accomplishments of society, from democracy to industrialization, all happen through the West. And because of that, it's a group to be able to embrace and take pride in being a part of. And then for the race realists, it's also a means by which to justify the idea that one particular group of people should not have any influence or control over governance and civil liberties, while another group should have undisputed control. People find meaning in many different things, whether it be religion, personal philosophy, political ideology, social identity, even biological identity. These are all avenues which a person can reflect upon themselves and both recognize their differences compared to the rest of the world and be able to embrace those as well. This new white national movement and the race realists that advocate for this ideology are individuals who take this core concept of identity and meaning and utilize it as a tool to gain an audience, to give a certain subset of people meaning in their lives. No matter how superficial that meaning may be, it's something that they can identify with. Just like a person can get sucked into a horrible religion, they did so because of something that they were seeking, something that they were yearning for outside of that. I think the same is true for a lot of the people in these types of movements. They're people who feel disenfranchised and alienated by the progress of society in the 21st century, and as a result, latch on to these certain ideologies that they come into from a very different direction than where they end up at the end of it. We'll be touching on that a little bit more when we talk about society, but in general, when you look at the individuals in groups like the Proud Boys or any of the other ethno-national groups that are around today, they do a lot to make sure that their appearance seems to be much more about anti-SJWism versus white identitarianism. They tend to try and put things into the context of an assault on their identity, their individual liberties, their core being by these outside invaders from different countries and different ideologies, and that they need to protect themselves from that. That's an incredibly powerful tool, and it's something that the race realists have been able to use very effectively. Now, obviously, there is no one way that a person gets sucked into these types of ideologies. There's no one way to be able to get out of it. It's a factor of multiple different things coming about to try and reinforce this central idea that you are somehow special, that you are protecting your culture from the invasions of outside forces. And with that, you get a weird array of people taking part in groups like this. Two examples that I find to be an interesting juxtaposition to one another. Enrique Tarrio. He's an activist for the Proud Boys, who, although they consider themselves not to be extremists, the rest of the world would disagree. They are a group where you definitely see a lot of ethno-nationalism, pretty extreme racial, social, and religious prejudices, and yet a person like Tarrio identifies as Afro-Cuban. So you're not just getting traditional white European males being the activists in these sorts of groups. You're getting people that come from a variety of different backgrounds, a variety of different personal experiences, and yet in spite of that, taking proactive roles in advocating for groups that work against their very own interests. Now, on one side of the extreme, you also have people that are just dealing with mental illness, and it is because of that that they are doing certain extreme behavior that is definitely racially motivated and is affected by the rhetoric that surrounds the issue, but it's an individual taking those actions to the extreme rather than the group he identifies with advocating for those actions to be taken. Clifton started screaming obscenities at the other individual and telling him to get back to his country before throwing sulfuric acid onto his face, causing second-degree burns all over the face and permanent scarring and disfigurement. Now, was that individual told to attack Hispanic people out in the streets? Was he following anybody's explicit commands to commit this act of violence against this other individual. Absolutely not. This is obviously an individual who has a very wide array of mental issues that happens to be driven by an ideology that makes him terrified towards people who come from some place that isn't where he's from, or that don't look the way that they're supposed to. Now, that being said, people like this are often motivated into action by the rhetoric of others, in spite of that other rhetoric not directly instigating the attack in and of itself. So, for an example, the Charlottesville protests. There was a tremendous amount of violence that ended up being instigated at that event. But of course, there's this specific event that ended up encapsulating the tragedy of that violence into one single instance. That individual definitely was a part of this group. That individual definitely had some deep-seated animosity or hatred towards those that advocated tolerance over nationalism. And it was because of that that he drove his car into a group of individuals and killed one. As frustrating as these groups may be, there is a distinct difference between advocating an overall position and advocating violence. And a lot of the most vocal spokespersons for any particularly controversial topic recognize this well enough that they know how to frame their rhetoric in such a way that it cannot be interpreted as a direct abdication of violence. And yet, in spite of them not directly advocating for violence, there are always a wide array of people that will take it to that extreme. Conversely, one can look at the Capitol Hill shooter, one of those rare exceptions of a far-left individual committing a mass shooting. And again, another very mentally unwell individual committing an act of extreme violence, even though him coming to that position did not derive from the rhetoric he was hearing directly. It's what he interpreted as being the next reasonable step. And as a result, he ended up committing a tremendous act of violence against people based on their political ideology. So it's not exclusive to any one group, any one religion, any one particular party. That being said, the attacks coming from this particular group through ethno-nationalists, white power groups, they've been growing quite a bit and tend to be a prevalent unifying factor between many mass shooters and mass killers. So given that this type of extremism is the exception rather than the rule, and yet we're still seeing a lot of growth in movements of this sort, why are they still able to garner so much appeal in spite of having such a bloody history, so to speak? And this is part of what I would say is the transition between organizational motivation and individual motivation, and that is interpretation of the media. A lot of the people that get into this type of a movement get there from an anti-social justice warrior mentality much more frequently than from a particular race advocacy sort of position. One of the biggest early draws into this type of a movement is opposition to the more extreme elements of what could be called social justice advocacy, but I don't even know if that's the right term for it. To demonstrate this sort of imbalance in interpretation, simply look at groups like Antifa, who I'm in no way defending, and their participation in assaults and other extreme activities, destruction of property, overall violence, protests, versus a lot of these people in groups like the Proud Boys and their types of actions in those movements. It tends to be very similar. These types of movements entice people into opposing them. So groups like this seem to formulate themselves around criticism of your opposition as opposed to any specific advocacy for your own side. You see this in a lot of Jared Taylor's stuff. He is much more likely to complain about something like affirmative action, and yet he is not anywhere near as capable of providing supporting data to his claims about there being a biological difference between white people and black people, a qualitative biological difference between those two groups. Instead of actually talking about why eugenics works on a scientific level, he instead wants to complain about how much harm social egalitarianism supposedly causes. Instead of talking about why he needs to be proud of being white, he'll often talk about it simply being an equal response to people being proud of being black. It's not, but it's like a young earth creationist or a flat earther. They don't have the actual data behind them to back up their position. So instead they look at extremist caricatures of the opposing side and try and use those as a representation of what they're fighting against. Because they can't stand up to the scrutiny of legitimate examination, instead they will just push back on the public reception of them. Which leads me back to a group like the Proud Boys, who pushes a lot of strong ethno-national tendencies, has been a part of different violent actions at a myriad of different protests, and generally has been nothing but an amalgamation of pretty nasty, shitty human beings. That being said, Mr. Tarrio here is a person that identifies as Afro-Cuban. Some of these people are married to black people. Some of these people have lifelong friends that are of a different race. The thing that seems to demonstrably unify this group is a bunch of everyday guys just trying to advocate for their everyday lives and their American liberties. That's not what the outcome of the rhetoric ends up being, but it's a rhetoric that they try to use to instill a sense of connection with other people that feel disenfranchised by the 21st century social justice activism. Now, as I'm saying all this, I again need to reiterate that just because it's what draws people into the group does not mean that it's a real representation of societal imbalance as a whole. But it is a useful tool to get people to try and think of this issue from a stance of opposing social justice activism as opposed to being an advocate for white ethno-nationalism. Even when they talk about race issues specifically, that's always what they focus on, is this idea of being able to advocate for your own identity just like anybody else. And therefore, there should be no difference between being able to be proud of being black or proud of being white. There is a tremendous array of differences with that, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But again, the factual basis of their motivations is a separate thing from the level of motivation that they have towards that particular movement. To be able to get more people to listen to them, to tolerate them, even if they don't agree with their position, and generally allow them much more of a platform than they've traditionally had. But before I get to that, because it will relate into that issue, I'll talk briefly about why black identity, quote unquote, is a very different thing than white identity. And the reason why there's a massive difference between these two is because of us white people, so to speak. When you keep a certain subset of the population as a secondary class of citizens, first as slave labor and then as free individuals that aren't quite human, all the way up until the 60s when we get the civil rights movement, and even from there, just look at the past 6 months, not even the past 6 years, and you'll see that there's still a lot of disparity between the treatment of one particular group versus the treatment of another particular group. And when it comes to black pride, black activism, we created that subculture by not allowing it to integrate into our own society. We caused that subculture to happen. And now somehow we take offense to them taking pride in being a part of the subculture that we forced them into over time. Now, compare that to being proud of being white. it's just such an anachronistic misinterpretation of both history and biology that it would almost be funny if it wasn't so sad. Because what was meant by being white has changed tremendously over time. White used to not include Italians. Definitely didn't include the Irish. Didn't include many, many different subcategories of white people. And to this day, often doesn't include Jewish people because, you know, they're a different kind of subhuman according to a lot of this ethno-national bullshit. So this classification of white being what you're proud of is something very different than what you see with Black social activism. It's more a broad assemblage of a wide variety of different people that you're all categorizing under their skin tone and saying that this is a group that should be able to advocate for their own superiority and dominion, both legally and socially. As Jared Taylor liked to put it, that whites deserve a place of their own where they have undisputed control over the domestic and democratic processes. And this has been a consistent tool that they've been able to utilize to draw people to a more and more extreme viewpoint over time by simply presenting themselves as being opposed to social justice rather than advocates for any type of white nationalism. And sadly, as true as I might think it is, when we call these people Nazis or fascists or whatever term you want to use, they can automatically turn back and say, well, I'm not a fascist, I'm not a Nazi for X, Y, or Z reason, I'm simply opposed to A, B, or C issue. And whether that's true or not, it's something that gets people paying attention to them, particularly if they feel some resentment towards or have any anger towards certain social, political, or ideological movements that they've had trouble with as a result of their own choices in life. And just to put a human face onto what I'm talking about here, one need look no further than a person like Count Dankula. He was charged with and convicted of causing offense to certain minority groups of people in his country, and thus had to pay a fine and get a criminal record for making a joke. No matter how tasteful or tasteless you might consider the joke to be, prosecution over something like that, particularly from an American's perspective, looks both idiotic and completely immoral. Now, I'm obviously not an expert in UK law, but I am an American. I passionately believe in the right to free speech. I believe, as an American, that you should have the right to be able to deny the Holocaust, to be able to say that white people are better than black people, to be able to say that we earned this land and didn't take it from the indigenous people, to be able to say that climate change is a hoax, that vaccines cause autism, that the earth is flat and only 6,000 years old. You should be able to do all of that in this country. And I would fight for anybody's right to be able to hold that opinion no matter how reprehensible it may be. Because if you do not support free speech for the person that you most fervently disagree with, or that you find to be the most distasteful, then you're not an advocate for free speech. You're an advocate for some people's free speech. And I know that that can be often the exception, and it's not even touching on the idea of platforms. But although I don't necessarily believe that any particular movement has the right to use any social media platform as an amplifier for their rhetoric, they have the right to extol their rhetoric in the places that will allow it to actually occur, whether that be mines or Stormfront. So although I may accept the principle of private organizations to be able to deplatform certain people, I would never want to see a person get prosecuted for simply extolling a belief, for simply making a joke. The only time that you should be able to prosecute a person for that is if they advocate direct acts of violence. Yet that's not the way that most of the world works. It's a criminal offense in Germany and the UK and most of Europe to deny the Holocaust, which is understandable considering how profound that event was, how much evidence there is behind it, and how disgracefully vile it is to claim that it didn't happen. But at the same time, I'm proud to live in a country where a person can be so despicable that they can oppose the reality of something like the Holocaust and not fear prosecution as a result. Because it's fucking America. What can I say? But going back to the original point on this, first off, I still fundamentally disagree with Count Dankula on a vast majority of issues, I would say, in terms of his general political stance. But one of the places that I do fundamentally agree with him is that he has the right to make any joke he wants to, no matter how offensive it may be. Unfortunately, he lives in a nation where that's not a possibility, and as a result, he's experienced prolonged harassment from individuals trying to vilify his character as much as humanly possible and calling him a Nazi on a regular basis. Now, I don't think that these are fair accusations, but it also makes it very understandable that he's been far more open and receptive to individuals on the far right than many other individuals would, because he has been labeled as being just as despicable as them, that he's a Nazi just like all the rest, that he's as bad as Jared Taylor, that he's as bad as Dick Spencer, that he's as bad as any of these individuals. And although some of his politics are awful, when you push a person like this, like not like him, but in this way, then they tend to really stop caring about your opinion on most issues, that even if you advocate for certain social issues that may be for good, that you're overall far too much of a hypocrite to be worth listening to. Now, I'm not saying that's how I feel. I'm saying that's how a person like Dankula would feel over a prolonged period of time. And it's what I think reaches in to the next broad issue that needs to be discussed, the final issue in this, which is how do these communities and groups find a foothold in society as a whole and a place to be able to espouse and advocate their ideas to a receptive audience. And part of that, like I said, both as the anti-SJWism and an individual like Count Dankula demonstrate, they are most effective at getting their message across when it's a reaction to political movements on the opposite side of the spectrum. Whether that opposite end of the political spectrum is actually representative of most people's opinions or feelings is pretty irrelevant. It has much more to do with what rhetoric are they able to utilize due to the actions of people on the opposite end of the political spectrum. And the best example that I've seen of this in recent years is the Southern Poverty Law Center. Below, I've linked a few articles with regards to this specifically and how abysmally this organization has been mishandled over the past 20 years. But moreover, when a group like this, that is supposedly a nonprofit charity dedicated to fighting hate groups, ends up putting people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Majid Nawaz onto their list of hate groups or advocates of hate speech, then they've lost the plot. I mean, they've completely lost the fucking plot. And it makes it much more easy to ignore everybody on their hate list when their watch list includes so many groups that are clearly not of that caliber. It diminishes the integrity of the organization as a whole when it tries to go after groups that are not representative of what they're supposed to be fighting against. And people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Majid Nawaz are not people that are advocating for hate or violence. They are not a hate group. Trying to put them into that pot when it's the same pot that you'll find people like Dick Spencer and Jared Taylor, those supposedly advocating against hate groups have handled things so poorly that they are no longer trustworthy. Now, that's just a particular example of extreme mismanagement and incompetence combined with an overly hyperbolic interpretation of what does and doesn't constitute a hate group. There are far more reasonable examples of this exact same thing that can cause people to, through antagonism towards somebody else's actions, become more receptive to the viewpoints espoused by somebody on the opposite end of the extreme. But again, it's a matter of what rhetoric can appeal to most people and draw them into our ideological viewpoints, and not so much about how sound our presentation of that ideological viewpoint really is. And of course, any time that there's somebody on the political left that makes a spectacle, it ends up being fuel for this fire in a way that the obscene actions of the right tend to never reach. For example, Jussie Smollett. Here's a guy who pulled some really stupid shit and tried to fabricate a hate crime, drawing attention to himself, misrepresenting the police department, and just generally being a pain in the ass. And the fact is that even though that might be the rare exception to the rule, it's something that every pundit and every spokesperson on the opposite side of the political spectrum can point to and say, see, they're just as bad as we are. They're just as much of hypocrites, and they have no high horse to be able to stand on and point down at us for our own actions. Now, that's fundamentally misunderstanding the imbalance between these two, or the basis of reality between these two. But again, reality, facts, evidence, these are all secondary when it comes to drawing people into a certain ideology. Emotions are far more effective in getting people to feel the way that you want them to feel, and then they can create the logical justification after, rather than trying to think themselves into this position and then let the emotions follow. And this does bleed over not only from the activist groups, but also into media representation. For every Vice magazine, there's a Breitbart. For every BuzzFeed, there's an OAN. For every Rachel Maddow, there's a Rush Limbaugh. And a lot of these organizations have discovered over time that it's far more effective to play to political ideology and personal feelings than it is to rely on facts and evidence. It's not something that's exclusive to either side, it's something prevalent throughout. And the thing is that there just seems to be far more of a microscope on the actions of the left than there is on the right. I wish I knew why that was. I think it's because the general sociopolitical situation is moving towards a more progressive stance, very slowly over time, and the most vocal advocates for traditional conservatism are the ones becoming the most obdurate towards it. And so the more and more society starts obdurately moving towards a place of greater egalitarianism, the more extreme and derisive the rhetoric begins to become. As a final recap, to summarize, individuals can get involved in a myriad of different social, political, ideological movements for a myriad of different reasons. Often those that become most passionate about a certain cause find their own sense of meaning through that activity. And meaning is something that we as individuals can be convinced into creating or create for ourselves, which means that some of the individuals who are part of these extreme ideological movements gain a lot of their personal identity through the movements that they take part in, which makes it all the more challenging to move away from it, even if you find the logical fallacies within. Because individuals are driven by emotional response and reactionism towards something that they see as offensive, far more than a personal drive towards their own social agenda. Organizations have been able to use this as a great means by which to get your message to a wider and wider audience. It is far easier as a tool to get people opposed to social justice or social progress than it is to get people hooked on a particular anachronistic viewpoint. Society on both sides of the political spectrum itself have played a huge contributing factor into evolving this ethno-national movement into what it is today. By using social change as a mechanism through which to motivate people onto their end of the political spectrum, while simultaneously pretending that their extreme viewpoint is being misrepresented by the hyperbolic nature of the left. But again, people get drawn into that not because of their racial views overall, but rather as an opposition to the social egalitarianism that they're seeing grow in society as a whole. As I had said, this affects all political affiliations, religious ideologies, social ideologies, political identities. There are just certain groups that tend to be more violently proactive in different points in time than others. And right now, the white national extremist movement is the one that tends to instigate the most acts of outright violence. Just look at these guys. Every single one of them have ties to extremist white national organizations. Does that mean that every shooter is doing it for racial motivation or racial bias? No. Does it mean that it's a certain type of ideological extremism that can manifest in terrorism that should be paid attention to? Yeah. I mean, just like when you see fanatical iterations of religious movements, such as Heaven's Gate or Waco, the Branch Davidians. And finally, that missteps and misrepresentations by certain aspects of the left have worked as phenomenal fuel to the extreme right for diminishing or demolishing the credibility of certain social advocacy groups, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center. When you can minimize the weight that an organization like that's capable of bringing to bear upon another individual, that's a tremendous step in diminishing the impact that organization can have as a whole. It affects their ability to target and investigate actual hate groups, and it also tarnishes their ability to harass individuals that they classify as being parts of hate groups when nothing in reality tends to demonstrate that. All right, well, thank you all for going on this long and bumpy ride with me. I appreciate it. This one didn't have as much quoting and citations in the initial discussion as some of my other stuff does, or like my last video did, but I have linked a lot of resources and citations below to some of the articles that I found valuable with regards to presenting this, and sources for some of the accusations that I made, such as the shortcomings of the SPLC and the news articles relating to the acts of violent extremism as well. So I guess with all that being said, I wish it was simpler, that it was more straightforward. But people are brought into the fold of their political, sociological, ideological movement for a wide variety of different reasons. And often it's the very acts that we try and do to oppose it that end up providing opportunities to be able to reach a wider audience. So I hope with this video I've been able to answer some of the hows that pulled people into these certain social movements. And I wish I could give more answers as to how to fix that. I wish I had answers. I do have a few things that I would like to discuss, which is going to be the third episode in this series. But hopefully through this, you can see some of those mechanisms and tools that these organizations use to be able to draw an audience, so that in your day-to-day life you can see those misrepresentations on your own and recognize what they are for what they are. So yep, that's it. I'm done. Thank you all for listening. On that final note, fuck you, Florida. Fuck you, heroin. Fuck you, fentanyl. And fuck you, Joe. Fucking miss the hell out of you, son of a bitch. And I always will. Love you, brother. Wherever the hell you are now. And I hope that you finally found some fucking peace.